generally. I mean, I think that somebody on the prior panel talked about DEI and B, and we always talk about DE and I, but we're starting to talk more about this idea of belonging. And when I talk through diversity, equity, and inclusion, I say that, you know, belonging is at the center of all of that. And I think if we can ensure that we're focusing on this idea of belonging, or focusing more on the idea of what can we do to drive a culture of inclusivity, that is going to then result in the diversity that we want. And so instead of focusing on, you know, one group over another group, or one issue over another issue, you know, if we can focus on this idea of making our environment inclusive, and whatever that means for your organization. Sometimes it might mean talking about white privilege. Sometimes it might mean talking about gay pride. You know, sometimes it might mean just in general talking about what it means to be Black in our society today. But focusing on that inclusivity, or that center of DE&I in terms of belonging, I think is going to go a long way in, you know, this environment, whether the legislation is, you know, enforced or not, right? We've got to look at what our environment looks like now, you know, and in order to ensure that we are moving diversity forward, I do think that we need to talk about all aspects of diversity without losing the individuality of each one of those.
That's good, thank you. Anybody else want to answer that question? Okay. Well, how are you all personally, and this will be our final thoughts, so any final thoughts about how are you personally continuing the work? And I know all of you in the roles that you play, you do this as a part of your roles, but we already talked about how this has to be something that's internal. This is something that you have to believe in order to keep pushing it, or to keep working towards it. So what are you personally or collectively within your organization or within your sphere of influence continuing to further DEI and B, I like that, work? Yeah, so what are you doing, modeling for the folks on the call to give them more ideas? How do they continue to educate in an anti-woke society? Y'all are so polite.
I'm happy to go first, and I saw someone reference what's going on at the Supreme Court right now, which is pretty fascinating case, right? Where we're seeing the best lawyers and legal minds in the world debate the value of diversity to society effectively, and how it's represented in higher education. And I think it's crucial that we approach that argument in two ways. Number one, as Nadine so compellingly said, we are all better when we have diverse perspectives in the room. And those perspectives do need to be racial on occasion. It is important that we respect that the lived differences and experiences of people based on the color of their skin in particular affects individuals in a way every bit as powerful as socioeconomic status. And that case needs to be really, really well made. And those of us who have experienced the value of those perspectives need to keep preaching it and demonstrating it. And simultaneously, I think we have to recognize that when the status quo, when left on its own, momentum, when not influenced by intentionality, leads to really what I would call uncomfortable, unwelcome, and ugly scenarios. You would end up with all white schools. You would end up with communities living more and more isolated from each other than they already are. Workplaces where, folks just hire their friends who all tend to look like them along the way. And this is true of, not just white folks, but all of us. We're all a little more comfortable with people who look like us for reasons that most of us get are obvious. And so it is crucial, if we're going to be effective going forward as a country, that we figure out ways to bridge those differences, and that leaders consistently point out how important it is. Because again, if you take that intentionality out of the equation, if you take those racial preferences, as the term that's being used in the Supreme Court right now, away, you end up with something that I think most of us would agree is no good. And that is, increasingly isolated communities where people are surrounded by their own bubbles of not just thought, but also appearance. And I certainly don't think that's where we want to be heading. So I would just encourage everyone to keep those conversations happening. And very importantly, that means keep talking to people that many of us disagree with, because they're our neighbors too.
Thank you. Don or Nadine?
You want to go, Nadine, or you want me to go? Okay, yeah, so, I'll echo what Brian said, maybe in a different way, but one of the things that I think is super important for me and hopefully for everybody that's on this call is the idea of no longer being silent. I think that many of us, if not all of us in the room, are in some position of power. I really like to say that anybody wields some power over someone else, right? And so we all have the ability to, share the importance of this inclusivity, having a dialogue, talking through many of these issues with other people that are in our sphere, right? And so when we're at the table, not holding that table hostage, trying to bring other people into the conversation, the dialogue, starting the dialogue, right? I know that many of us have gotten so tired of having to be the one to say, why aren't we considering a woman? Why aren't we considering somebody who's diverse? But we still need to be able to do that, and to ensure that that voice is being heard that's not at the table. And so this idea of being silent or going along to get along, we need to just stop that and ensure that we sort of take the anti-bullying approach. If you see something, say something, because somebody else is likely thinking the same thing, but they may not feel it that they have the same amount of power that you can wield to actually say something. And so, I would say that that's one thing I'm trying to do more and more, even more than I've done in the past, is not being silent, being that ally and ensuring that, people in the room know that they have someone that's going to speak up for them. And then the people that are not in the room know that I'm going to be the one to raise my hand and say, this is not right, and we're going to do something different.
Thank you. Nadine? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just leave a couple of parting thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just leave a couple of
Oh, Dawn, you have to mute again. There we, yeah. For whatever reason, it was creating an echo. One is to remind people that a judge has so far stopped this law from being enforced as being unconstitutional. We believe it is unconstitutional. And every business, every nonprofit, everybody in the state of Florida should pursue diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I would say pursue it even more aggressively. And I think that it's important to remember that it requires bravery to make these breakthroughs, to step into these spaces and say, this conversation is actually even more important. And the genesis and the purpose of this law tells us why it is more important. America is in the midst of a demographic collision between what is called the graying of America and the browning of America. And the graying of America, because of healthcare inequities and other things, is disproportionately white, older, more money, more power, turns out to vote with greater regularity. But the emerging generation, there's no racial majority. We are a plurality of races and cultures and experiences. And that's the America that's being born right now. And the folks who hold power are disproportionately terrified of losing privileges that they don't even want to acknowledge exist, but in the pursuit of these laws that stifle conversation, that censor in our schools and in our workplaces, they are saying, yeah, actually, we do know that's something. We're fearing a thing being lost, even if we don't acknowledge with our words that it exists. And so I think the challenge for us is not to shout down this generational divide, but to actually have the real conversations, to engage in those conversations. And they're tricky because I may disagree fundamentally with the the reason for the fear that drives so much of our politics right now, the build the wall, the, don't talk about race, it makes me uncomfortable. I want, all of you go back in the closet, all of these things. If I don't understand it, I fear it and I don't like it. I may disagree so vehemently with that, but it doesn't actually make the fear not real. It is. And I'll end with this little moment that I had one time years ago, talking to the head of a chamber of commerce when we were trying, this is long before marriage equality, we were trying to get domestic partnership passed. And people said, you got to go talk to this person who runs a big chamber. But I just want to warn you, super conservative guy. I don't think he's with you on these issues. So I go see this guy. It took me a while to get the appointment. And I go to his office, and instead of meeting his office, he takes me to this little corner room that's made of glass, and it's tiny, and he's a tall man. And as we sit there, there's almost no room for my knees. And I'm thinking, this must be some business school power play thing that I don't know. But every vibe I was getting was, he's trying to intimidate me, right? And I thought, let me just try and build rapport with him, separate from the ask. And I just said, how did you end up in this role that you have? And he said, well, it wasn't my plan when I went to college. I wanted to be a meteorologist. But when I graduated, and this is a white man, he said, when I graduated, they weren't hiring people of my race or my gender, right? I'm thinking, okay, well, it's a bit chilly in here. But instead I said, that must have been really painful to have a dream, to want to do a thing, and to arrive at the conclusion that your race and your gender are preventing you. I'm sure that was a hard pill to swallow. And he kind of softened a little bit. And I said, why do you think that was the case? And we sat there, and I don't know how much time passed. It felt like 2 hours, but probably just a few seconds. And he said, because before then, everyone they hired was my race and my gender. And from that moment, we had a different engagement, because I could hear his pain, but also try to shine the spotlight on a part of it that maybe he hadn't routinely included in that story. And it turned out, because I think his wife was an anchor or had some news experience, she had maintained her last name. And so he had an experience of his wife being hospitalized and him not being immediately recognized as her spouse because their last names weren't the same. So he had a place where he could have some empathy around gay couples who could not be legally married and often had different last names, being denied access to one another in the hospitals. And he ended up being really a linchpin in getting domestic partnership passed. And so I say that because this process, this thing that we do, is not about vilifying and demonizing. It's about connecting, not backing away from the values that animate what we do, not erasing our humanity. And there's some people who will not approach you in good faith. But for people who will, it's usually ignorance, and ignorance isn't a bad thing. We're all ignorant about a thing until we learn about it. But I would say to everyone, do not let a government censorship campaign stop you from being really curious and bringing empathy into conversation. So you can say, yeah, I never thought about that. I never thought about how difficult it is for someone who uses a wheelchair to navigate this space we created. I never thought about it because I had the privilege of not thinking about it. It doesn't make me a monster. It's just my world didn't encompass having to think differently. And finally, I'm on the Florida Chamber Foundation board, and some of the research tells us, even now in Florida, that you can look at where somebody was born and predict fairly with great certainty whether they're going to graduate high school or end up incarcerated. That is systemic. That is a thing that has nothing to do with that individual baby, but the circumstances that child is born into. And those systems that take away our individuality, those things we have to dismantle. So the problem isn't white people, it's white supremacy. The problem is racism. The problem is all of these things that we have to collectively dismantle so all of us have an opportunity to thrive.
If there was ever a moment to drop the mic, that would have been the moment. Thank you all so much for everything that you contributed to this conversation. I learned a lot and walking away fuller from having the opportunity to listen to each of you. So thank you so much. And I'll pass it back over to, am I passing it to you, Eric?
Yes, you are. Thank you so much to Dr. Joseph, Nadine, Brian, Don, for an incredible panel. I mean, it is hot like fire out here. We are definitely having some mic drops, lots of great information. Loving this moment. Super excited about what's coming next. We do have a special guest in the house, and wanted to give him a moment to say a little something together to all of you, specifically around the idea of community, being in this together, being stronger together, and also just to give a quick shout out of history. He is the first African American mayor in the city of St. Petersburg. So I'd like to give a shout out to Mayor Ken Welch and give him a chance to say a little something to all of you. Mayor, you got to come off mute, sir.
Okay. Good morning. Can you hear me now? Okay. I keep getting an unmute myself message. Can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yes, you're good.
It is great to be there. I caught a couple of minutes of Nadine, and man, what a powerful message. I'm excited to be here, and what a important time for us to have this conversation. And Eric asked me to just talk about my perspective on how we move forward in this polarized atmosphere. And as it happens, yesterday was the anniversary of my election. I was elected November 2nd last year. And throughout the campaign, my message was intentional equity and inclusive progress. And I think at a human level, I think people understand the fact that as a community, we can't achieve our highest level of success if large segments of our communities don't have hope and don't have equal access to opportunity. And I view equity as equal opportunity informed by history, facts, and then the cumulative impact of our historical realities on our current circumstances. And one example I talked about on the campaign trail and I talk about now is the historic gas plant, which was termed Tropicana Field. If you weren't aware of the history of that area, you see 86 acres that are ripe for redevelopment. In fact, it's been called a blank slate many times. But if you understand that before baseball was there, it was an actual community, and the promises that were made to that community and the displacement that happened in the pursuit of progress, homes, businesses, residences, institutions, churches, all moved with a promise of inclusive economic development, then you know it's not a blank slate. And to me, that's a perfect example of what informed economic, an informed approach to economic development actually means. And so that's the message that we talked about throughout the campaign, and we won by 20 points in a historic margin. And so I think folks understood the importance of us all moving forward together and really being intentional about equitable economic development. On top of that, we had a structural racism study that documented what had happened in our city over the years. We also had a disparity study that showed underutilization of minority businesses. So in my view, the case for intentional equity was made here as it's been made in many other communities. But after the case is made, then we have to be really strategic, I think, in our response, and then committed to implementation, because a lot of folks talk equity, but when it comes time to actually make it happen, you don't see the same level of commitment. And it's pretty simple: follow the money. You won't make everyone happy, because the reality of equity means that some entities will have to make less than a maximum profit. For example, the historic gas plant RFP process, you might be familiar with, where a master developer was selected, but I found that they had a really small amount of affordable housing and workforce housing in their proposal, even after I asked, for what adjustments they might make to the final two development teams. One came back with a robust model that had upwards of 4,000 units of affordable housing and offsite, and the other didn't change theirs at all. It had a really small amount. And so I canceled the RFP and issued a new RFP, renamed it the gas plant redevelopment RFP, because that recognition of history, I think, is important. And so that is when I think you have to show intentionality. And the overall response to that was really positive. But there were those who were set to make substantial gains who were not pleased. And then some complaints began about our development process, or we're anti-development. And so I just think we have to be prepared when we're intentional about equity, that most people are going to support you based on that case that we've made. But those who want to maximize profits or don't want to see change are going to fight against that. We have to be ready for it. And that same pattern evolved as I reviewed other development deals. I terminated those as well. The municipal services building, the TPA Moffitt deal, which would have sold city land at a $19 million discount. And the developer only offered 10% of the units in the proposed hotel and residences to be affordable to workforce on city-owned land, when we are in the midst of a historic housing crisis. So again, I terminated that. The complaints came, but I think intentional equity demanded that decision. And so we've also had other, I think, positive moves. We raised all part-time workers to $15 an hour. We allocated the large share of our $45 million in American Rescue plans to housing. And today the council is approving social service hubs, which provide mental health and other support in the community. That's what we're using that American Rescue Plan money for. We've hired a supplier diversity manager, and we have in the approved budget a DEI office. And I think, interestingly, because no one lost revenue on those items, we didn't hear a lot of complaints about that. So I think that's the pattern. I'm excited about where we are. As Congressman John Lewis said, a lot of this is necessary trouble, but intentional equity sometimes demands that. So I'm excited about the workshop today, excited for all the work y'all are doing, and encourage you to continue your great work. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks a lot, Mayor Welch. Just before you go, one quick thing maybe you can leave for everyone in terms of your perspective. How can we as a community be stronger together and end this together?
We've just got to let our voices be heard. And when, particularly for me, when a policy issue comes up, if we agree that housing is important, if we agree that business opportunities for underrepresented parts of our community is important, then we need to speak up. I mean, it can be as simple as an email or a Facebook post, a Twitter post, but we can't be silent, because there are organized groups out there trying to build a narrative. When we see what's happening with the whole anti-woke drive, we've got to let our voices be heard and make sure that lawmakers hear our voices.
Thank you so much, Mayor, for your time. I know you're super busy, but please stay on as long as you can and enjoy some of the great perspective and conversation that we'll have. But again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.
All right. So now we're going to move into our next panel. And I will tell it's how do your dimensions of diversity impact effective engagement within DEI. And it's Dr. Lindsay Grove. So I will pass the mic to Dr. Grove.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for having me moderate this panel. I was so excited to hop on when Mayor Welch was also on, so thank you so much for spending time with us today. I'm very excited to moderate this particular panel. How do your dimensions of diversity impact effective engagement within diversity and inclusion, or D&I? We're very lucky to have three amazing panelists today. The first is Whitney Booz. She is a senior corporate and compliance regulatory risk analyst and lead at the Global Fraud Solutions Review at TransUnion. She's a dedicated and accomplished compliance risk professional in the financial services and banking industry with expertise in risk and controlled program development, project management, risk governance, and regulatory compliance over the past 8 years. In 2021, Whitney became an award-winning diversity and inclusion leader from the National Diversity Council after nominating her ERG as top 50 employee resources group. You can learn a lot more about her in the conference program as well. We also have Andres Gonzalez. He has successfully created and implemented community engagement, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, and supplier diversity programs for a number of the country's most respected healthcare organizations. He works for Freighter Health and started there in 2015. He currently serves as the Vice President of Community Engagement and the Chief Diversity Officer for the Health Network, which includes 11 hospitals, over 2,000 physicians, and more than 45 health centers and clinics in Wisconsin. So fellow Midwesterner, excited to have him here. And last but certainly not least is Daniel Gibson. He's a passionate community leader and advocate for social justice, who has spent the past 2 decades championing causes to eradicate racism and poverty in the United States. He has created and implemented nationally recognized programs for jail and prison reform, affordable housing, access to medical care for the chronically homeless, HIV/AIDS prevention, and LGBT rights. Today, he works in philanthropy as the Regional Vice President for Allegheny Franciscan Ministries, which is a private foundation in Florida. And recently, which is amazing, is a Robert Wood Johnson Culture of Health Fellow. So congrats to you, Daniel. That's huge. Again, all of our panelists have amazing extended bios if you want to take a look at those. And I'm just going to start. The first question that I have for the 3 of you is explain what you identify with or what your dimensions of diversity are within your workplace. And so we can start with Whitney.
Okay, excellent question, by the way. I hope you all are having a great morning. It's 7:54 my time. I'm in Vegas, so bear with me. But for me, in regard to that question, I like to use your typical diversity wheel to identify myself, which is in that external dimension that consists of some of those visible and mostly non-visible identities, such as my Southern accent, which falls into that language category. If you ask someone about me, I lead with my personality. Not sure what my personality identified as, but maybe a people person or bold character. But in relation to within the workplace, that would fall under that organizational dimension. If I were to put those identities in a sentence, it would be, I work remotely out of Henderson, Nevada as a senior analyst with over 8 years experience in compliance risk. Right there, I just called out 4 different organizational identities, such as work location, seniority, work experience, and my department. These are some of those non-visible identities that intersect and that we carry into the workplace each day. Some people only think of those typical internal identities such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, etc. For myself, I am a Black, Nigerian, and Irish cisgendered woman who is heterosexual. Imagine that being your elevator pitch. Sounds better to connect with those non-visible identities for sure, right? So I think to answer that question, that is how I identify within the workplace, is in regard to those organizational dimensions.
Thank you so much for that. Let's go to Daniel. Daniel, same question. Explain what dimensions of diversity you identify within the workplace.
Sure. I'm just going to go straight to personal, and I think it's worth noting that I currently am with Allegheny Franciscan Ministries, which is a Catholic organization. And when I interviewed with Allegheny, who was a funding partner of mine when I was on the provider side over at the Lord's Place in Palm Beach County, one of the very first questions I asked in my interviews, are you going to be okay with me being openly gay? You're a Catholic organization. I'm an openly gay man. I've lived an openly gay lifestyle professionally for 15 years, and I'm not going back in the closet. Is that going to be an issue? And in the interview, it was assured to me that it would not be an issue if I were to be chosen, and I was chosen. And it has presented not to be an issue internally. So there's more I can share about that, but I am an openly gay man who is often led with that, I guess, in my adult life. And yet in the past 3 years in particular, throughout COVID, being locked up into my house and watching the race crisis that has erupted, not that has been created, it's always been there, but it has erupted into the visibility of this world. My identity as a Black man also has become extremely more important for me to lead with. And maybe we'll talk about that as we go through, but I'm a biracial man. I've always been very proud to say I'm biracial for my Italian roots as well, Black and Italian, although I live in Miami now. So now I am secretly coming out as Black every day because people think I'm Latino. I ain't. And I have to fight people on that every day, but I'm an openly gay Black man who has a theater background and is quite dramatic and has lots and lots of fun. And we can talk more about that, about how that impacts my role in the workplace.
Thank you for sharing that. And Andres, how would you
Sure.
answer this question?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Lindsay and Eric and Inclusivity for having me here. I'm always winning if I'm with Whitney and Daniel in terms of, sharing the stage here, the virtual stage. So thank you for having me. I would say the way that I identify, and I think I certainly appreciate how Whitney opened up, but I will probably stick a little bit more with kind of the Daniel's perspective, or maybe, how he identified in terms of much more of those personal primary dimensions. I happen to be part of the Hispanic Latino, so ethnicity wise, and I tend to lead with that, given what has transpired over the last 3 years as well, especially in the greater Milwaukee area, where we saw the exacerbation of how our marginalized communities have been left behind and impacted by COVID, and the social impact and the social unrest or injustices that occurred here, being one of the most segregated cities in America. So very proud of being part of the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx community. Happened to be Puerto Rican. So my mother actually uprooted us many, many years ago from Puerto Rico and took us to Cleveland, Ohio, of all places. So neither here nor there in terms of she missed the weather memo, but that's a whole different discussion with her. Generationally, I'm part of the Gen X generation. And I also happen to be bilingual, bicultural. First generation college student, very proud of that. And that's actually very significant to me, given my lived experiences and certainly what a lot of our frontline, diverse, marginalized staff members sometimes, experience. And then obviously very proud that my oldest two boys, I'm a military parent, my oldest two boys are serving in the military, in the Army. They're both non-commissioned officers, very proud of their service because they preserve my freedom, or our freedom for that matter. So certainly that's another dimension of diversity that I certainly very proud of. And certainly I'm an ally to. I'm an ally to the LGBTQ plus community, to our BIPOC communities, and to the disability community as well. So certainly try to continue to do my own work around my own cultural competence, part of that journey, to make sure that I show up as an ally in every single room that I'm actually fortunate enough to be sitting around those tables.
Thank you all for sharing that. And I love that you all touched on different types of identity, whether that was personal, professional. I love that, Andres, I love that you talked about that your generational identity, which I think we certainly talk about a lot, but it's not something that we always necessarily come forward with as a part of our identity. So that's great. So in that same space, let's talk about, what do you feel the advantages or disadvantages of these dimensions have been when you have discussions about engagement in diversity and inclusion? And whoever wants to go first. Okay.
I can go. I think that was an excellent question when it comes to the advantages and disadvantages, because we can name all of the advantages, but then how do we get into what that looks like if there is a disadvantage? I think starting with advantages, diverse environments are business critical. Diverse teams perform better. Diverse thoughts matter, right? To elaborate on that latter part, diversity of thought is such a critical component to making the engine run. It's the oil that runs through the gears. If you have a team of people from the same hometown, similar upbringing, same degree, basically their internal and external dimensions are 90% the same, there will be less chance of constructive opposition, innovation, and new creative ways to solve problems and issues. Having a diverse team does not only mean to ensure that, there's at least one Black woman on the team and one Latino man, but it's also understanding the element of having genuine conversation to learn about that person and how they think differently. I remember in school, our algebra teacher would give us no credit for a problem, even if the answer was correct. If we solved it differently than what was taught or was not in the book, it was wrong, even if it resulted in the correct answer. So sometimes we are taught to think like this as adults, but I think we are unlearning this behavior as a community. There's progress there, but we are definitely all very different, and we learn and process things differently. We should think that same way about our identities. As for disadvantages, we may be too focused on those visible identities. And I think that previous panel kind of touched on it a bit. And we're filling in these optical quotas, right? Versus genuinely pulling out those non-visible identities from, the hiring process to the existing associate populations. So that's my take on that.
Thank you. Andres?
Yeah, so I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach, and I obviously concur and agree with what Whitney actually shared. I'm going to start with the disadvantages and then work progressively to the advantages. I think in terms of the disadvantages that I think I have experienced, or any diverse individual, probably with kind of the same type of dimensions of diversities that I bring to the table, have experienced, are things, for example, that when they hear me speak and they hear an accent, there's bias and there's a perception that my accent equates to being uneducated, that I might be certainly undocumented. And I have had really interesting discussions along the way of, if you know your history, you would know that as Puerto Ricans, we are US citizens since we were born. And so you have to have those discussions with individuals, right, to educate them. And I call them crucial conversations that you have to have with individuals. But that has given me the lived experiences and the insights to really understand the importance of engagement and a sense of belonging for the staff that I represent, right? I am honored to be the Vice President of Community Engagement and Chief Diversity Officer. So the work that I love to do, right, that I get to do, that I was born to do, is the work, right, that I can certainly be very focused on, strategically and intentional about in my own workplace. And so what I have done is really understand what are some of those lived experiences, what is it that continues to be a barrier or an issue for our staff at all levels, and how can actually I become right in oftentimes, and actually I have used this terminology. As a matter of fact, yesterday I was talking to our CEO who chairs our diversity council, and I said, Kathy, oftentimes, I have to be the conscience of the organization because we have made a pledge, we've made a commitment, we have strategies in place. And when I see that we are eroding or that we've made a promise and we're not living up to it, I have to call us out. And I do it lovingly. I do it diplomatically, but nonetheless, I have to call us out if we are not delivering on what we have promised, both to our staff of providing them an equitable and inclusive experience within the workplace, so then they can actually help us, right, to carry out that exceptional patient experience to certainly our BIPOC communities here in the greater Milwaukee area. And so those are the kind of the disadvantages. And so what I do is I understand that I round on all of our staff to understand their lived experiences, what are the barriers that they're confronting, and then making sure that I keep a good pulse of that, and I bring that back to the executive team when I sit around that table to really have some honest discussions. I'm very fortunate, by the way, and I'll close with that I work for an organization that values everyone, that values our BIPOC communities as staff members, but also as we are a healthcare provider here in the region, and that we provide care to all, not to some, but to all. And that's really important to us, so much so that we have added that as part of our mission when we refresh our mission and our values about a year and a half ago. So again, that's how I, tend to actually look at that, and what I try to do in terms of my own call to action, and how I try to keep the organization and my peers, focused and committed to the work that we have set forth as part of our strategic plan.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay and Andres and Whitney. Y'all are killing it. I'm gonna say I started with the fact that I work for a Catholic organization intentionally. I had intended when I signed up for this panel discussion to really talk about how being an openly gay man has impacted the work that our organization is doing. And yet in the last 24 hours, and specifically in the last hour and a half, 2 hours being on this conference, I've decided to make this extremely personal conversation for me. And the truth of the matter is, I'm going to share something that, and I'm going to lead with that. It's going to feel uncomfortable to some people, and it's going to be a microaggression, and people are going to go, "That's not right. Please don't troll me or hate me for saying this." But this is the truth. Is that when I started off as an actor when I graduated from college, first person in my family to go to college, another identity. Went to a great college, Ivy League college, and was an actor for 10 years. And then I moved to Florida and I didn't know what to do with my life. And I went to social work school. And someone came up to me and they said to me, "Oh my God, you're gonna kill it. You are a Black, gay, articulate, educated man. You're gonna kill it. You're gonna have an amazing career." And I went, "What?" And they said, "There are no Black, educated, articulate, creative men in social work." And so that's the microaggression, by the way. And I now really, what I took at that point is, "Oh, well, that's awesome." I now realize how destructive that kind of language is and conversation is. In hindsight, I have done very well. I moved pretty quickly from graduating with my master's in social work into some executive positions at different organizations in this state, and I've had a wonderful career. But it's interesting that because of the way that I talk, and someone mentioned in the other conference, they talked about the code switching, right? The reason I talk the way I talk has nothing to do with how I was raised. If you talk to my brothers and sisters, they don't talk like me, but it's because I'm an actor. And because when I went to acting school, literally the teacher said they couldn't understand me because I spoke with my sort of urban accent that I had lived growing up in Los Angeles. And I had to learn how to enunciate. And now people go, "Where the hell are you from?" Because they can't understand. I have this weird ass accent that nobody can sort of identify who I am. And it's actually quite embarrassing when I go home because I'm flipping my T's and hitting my S's and I don't sound like anybody in my family. And I don't think that's a positive. It's an exact negative of me. So what does it mean to speak Black? What does it mean to sort of represent your culture? These are the things that I now stand up for. And that's why I say I used to identify so closely with my gay identity, because when I walk through a door, people don't necessarily know that right away, right? They know my race. And yet now I also want to stand up and say, I'm just one representation of an educated Black man. There are other educated Black men who maybe don't speak like me and don't talk like me. That's cool. So that's one of the advantages. And I don't know if because of any of that, it had a positive impact on my career. But as I have matured and mellowed into my professional work in social services and now in philanthropy and living openly gay in my lifestyle, one disadvantage that I think of all the time is, have I come too far out the closet to matriculate in an organization and in an industry, right? Am I too gay to be the CEO? And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing that, because I know that that's a question I know that is not unique to you or to anyone else. And also just, somebody pointed out in the chat how much language, how powerful language can be, whether it's how we speak, what we speak, who we speak to. So thank you for sharing that, Daniel.
And
Oh, go ahead, Whitney.
I wanted to piggyback off of that. Sorry for interrupting. I think that was so excellent, Daniel. You struck a nerve with me with that, because I feel I walk in that when it comes to my accent. Living in Florida, coming from Clearwater, Florida, and growing up in the projects and being the first to go to college. My dad was a Marine, but I was the first to go to college. And then moving to South Carolina in middle school. And then now I have this Southern, thing going on with my voice. And then moving to San Diego in high school, and everyone being like, you sound so country, and and even relocating, back to the West, a year ago here in Vegas, and everyone saying that, oh, I just love your Southern accent. And so I think, in Florida, people would say, oh, you sound very urban, right? But then on the West, I sound very Southern, right? And to get personal, like how Daniel got personal, but a little bit more personal, I was dating this guy and he was from the Midwest, and he would always try to correct my sentences. And I had to correct him about that. I'm like, listen, I'm a Southern girl, and I'm going to say ain't, and I'm going to not make sense when I speak in conversation. Sometimes it's not going to be politically correct. It's not going to be, proper sentence structure. The sentence is not going to, be complete. But this is how I talk, and I cannot help that. And I'm comfortable, and I've been able to get this far in life. And I don't need you to be my grammar teacher. And we had a conversation about that, and he was like, well, my mother did that to me growing up because she worked at a post office and the people she interacted with. And I said, how did that make you feel? And he said, I hated it. And I said, then why would you do that to me? And so sometimes people don't realize that they're putting their own stuff on other people. And so, that made me, think about that time where I had to basically stand up for my accent. So I just wanted to interject there, but thanks, Daniel, for being vulnerable in that moment, because it made me think about that.
Thank you so much for sharing that too, Whitney. So I know we talked a little bit, I know Andres touched on this a little bit, but how have your dimensions impacted your professional trajectory? And you also touched on this too, Daniel. I kind of would love to hear a little bit more about sort of your professional trajectory. So whoever wants to go.
Actually, I'll jump in right there.
Sure.
Thank you for sharing that also. Yeah, interestingly enough, when I joined the team with Allegheny 7 years ago, I had that private conversation with the person interviewing me, our CEO, Eileen, who is a wonderful ally and just a wonderful woman in general. And then I started to get calls from my LGBT friends, my gay friends and brothers and sisters who are in the region where we were grant making, and they're like, how are you working for a Catholic organization? What the hell are you doing? And, they would never fund us. And I was like, well, I started to give advice on how to get money at Allegheny quietly. It was like, well, just don't lead with the gay thing, lead with the services, right? And I'm giving all this advice. And one day I had the nerve to talk to Eileen in supervision. And I said, I want to just make sure that I'm giving good advice. I don't want my friends to sort of waste their time applying for funding. And I told her what my advice was, and she was like, well, no, that's not right. Like we would fund them, lead with the gay thing, let them know that we accept all applicants, we accept all vulnerable populations. And what I learned was that the spectrum of political ideation within the Catholic Church in itself is so large and so colorful that for us to believe that the ideations of Catholics is one thing, is one party, is one way of voting, is just not true. And I have learned, I'm not Catholic myself. I was born Pentecostal. That's a whole nother session. But what I realized was I was carrying my own internal assumptions about Catholicism, about their perception of me as a gay person, about their support of our community, that was actually harming my community because I was preventing access to resources to my own community because of false ideologies, false information. And I was so grateful for Eileen to open up my eyes. Around that time, it was 2016, I'll finish with this. We then started to quietly support groups like the Muslims and LGBT communities and Black and Brown leaders and organizations because of what was going on politically in the country. It became really important to us as leaders within the organization, but we were doing it quietly. And I think it was the conversation that Eileen and I shared. I'm not saying it was the only thing. We've always been the organization that has been inclusive, and I can share more stories later on about that if we get there. But what we started to do in 2018 was to be more intentional about the language, to actually say we are prioritizing for groups that serve the LGBT community. And we are prioritizing serving members of the disability community and people and of other faiths and immigrations. And we got so many new applicants and partners coming to us, and we were just so delighted to see the shift in partnerships and relationships that we've been able to form because of that. And I think it was just because of the bravery that I had that one day, and also the education I was able to receive about Catholicism, that opened my eyes for the positive.
I love that. I think it's important to have those brave conversations. Andres, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I will certainly. I'm going to stick to one of the comments that I made earlier about, my own lived experience, especially in healthcare, as it relates to being, an immigrant coming in and having an accent. And the system actually will stay nameless for the sake of, confidentiality here. And certainly I don't want to embarrass or expose anyone for that matter. But it was interesting. In one of the healthcare systems where I was actually growing up, I remember having a conversation with one of our C-suite folks at the time. And it was one of those conversations that was brokered by my mentor, who was actually a phenomenal individual from the community, also Hispanic Latino. He was kind of considered the godfather of the Hispanic Latino community in the Cleveland area. And he knew this individual who worked for that healthcare system and said, hey, I'm going to broker here conversation so at least you get some exposure to him and you can have a conversation and see where that goes. And our conversation actually started going down the path of career progression, aspirational goals. And I remember that I asked him flat out and I said whether he thought that I would have a shot in that organization. And he looked at me, and I remember he looked at me and he said, do you want me to sugarcoat my answer or do you want the truth? And I said, nope, just be raw, right? Give me the truth. And he said, Andres, I'm going to be very honest with you. In this organization, someone like you, as smart as you are, as accomplished as you are, you will never get to the C-suite because you do not look like many or all of us. You don't speak like many of us. You didn't go to the Ivy League that many of us went to, right? So you are at a disadvantage from that perspective. And quite frankly, if I can be extremely honest with you, while many individuals know of you, they know the great work that you lead for us, both internally and externally, they are extremely uncomfortable with your stance in many issues. And so you will never progress here. And I remember that those words just pierced my heart because it was one of those things, right, that it deflates you. But now, right, in retrospect, and I still have a relationship with this individual, I really appreciated the raw, how raw he was and how honest, brutally honest he was, because what he did let me know is that, you can continue to do great work here, but you have actually reached your ceiling. Unfortunately, you're as good as what you're doing right now. You're not going to go any farther than that, because obviously we will not value you in this organization. And actually, he was one of those first individuals that said to me, if I were you, I would start expanding my wings. And I'm more than happy to actually help you. And he became not only a mentor, but also a sponsor over time. And some of the best things that I learned along the way, including business acumen, financial acumen, I learned it from that individual. And so I say all that to say that unfortunately, that is the reality, the lived experience for many, many, many individuals in our communities, right? I mean, if you're part of the BIPOC community, or you're part of a diverse community, or marginalized or vulnerable community, those are the lived experiences that individuals, experience on a daily basis. And so the one piece now that I'm extremely careful of is that I've been able to reach the C-suite. And as one of my boys will say, he says that one of the things that I love about you is that you're extremely resilient, and you have, and this is his wording, not mine. I think I'm going to actually make some of you laugh, because it's not my vernacular, but it's his. And he says, you actually allow your haters to become your motivators, Dad. And I have seen that time and time again. And his point is you don't let adversity stop you. You find ways of overcoming that, or using that as your challenge to get to the next level. And that is something that my oldest son actually, kind of quoted to me a number of years ago. And it was like, oh, so that my haters are my motivators. I like that. I mean, it's true. And I think that being told no became a good challenge for me. It's like, well, I'm going to prove you wrong. And I'm actually going to go and do it, not so much because I want to aspire to it, but just to prove you wrong. That someone like me, with my background coming from very humble beginnings, can do that and can excel at that particular role. And so I think that that's really the piece that actually resonates, and that I actually hold dearly to this date, knowing, by the way, that now I actually have a ton of privilege, because now I come at a very high level within an organization where I navigate at a very different level, right? And so I, take many things for granted at times. And it's not until I'm actually rounding with a lot of our frontline employees that it actually breaks my heart to hear their lived experiences, how they get treated, the type of terminology they're referred by. And it's like, really? That happens here? And it's like, yeah. And so they tell me that all the time. And it's one of those things of, well, now you're giving me more, fuel to the fire here. Thanks for letting me know. We're going to actually go and solve those issues. And so I am cautious of that, right? That while I get to lead great work, I also know that I bring a ton of privilege, and I have to stay honest and true and connected to a lot of our frontline employees to really understand their lived experience, because mine now has been perhaps a little bit tainted by, the level at which, I came in, or right, the, hierarchical navigation, or, by a lot of those things that I am actually fortunate to have at my disposal, just by way of who I am and the title that I actually hold for the organization. So I got to actually check myself constantly about, am I missing the mark? Am I honestly out of touch with the realities of our staff members? Because I want to make sure, again, that I'm actually able to be an advocate, that I can be certainly continue to be an ally, and that I continue to be, again, that spokesperson for the work that needs to happen, and especially maybe sometimes give a voice to those that feel that might not be empowered, or feel, obviously voiceless based on their lived experiences. And so that is something that I tend to actually check myself and ask my team constantly to keep me honest about. So that's a little bit of my, the way that I would answer that question, because I think it's one of those where I have a foot here and a foot there, and it's part of my dichotomy, if you will, and dissonance at times as well. So.
Thank you for that. Whitney, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to say, have you ever heard of an anomaly? It sounds like we're all anomalies here. And we're living it, we're the first in so many different roles and different, life experiences, like from what Andreas was saying and Daniel was mentioning earlier. You know, despite me being the youngest in almost every role since I've joined the workforce, but oftentimes the only Black woman. You know, can you imagine being the first in all of your roles? Like, that's big pressure. Like, that's bigger shoes to fill. You know, you're the first representation there. And because of this uniqueness of being the first, you know, or the youngest, or the only Black person, or the only Black woman, you know, or all of the above at the same time, it was important for me to always lead authentically and with personality, of course, right? And I think that goes into what like Daniel was mentioning, like, what do I lead with? You know, do I lead with the gay first? Or, you know, and for me, it was, I want to lead with my personality. You know, I don't want you to think about my education. I don't want you to think about my accent. I don't want you to think about, you know, how's Whitney hair going to be different this week? Because it always changes, you know. Right now I'm giving, you know, natural curls. Next week it's giving, you know, blonde, you know, whatever, you know. So, you know, one of my friends told me once, she was like, you know, you're the only person that I know that can show up authentically. In my previous organization, I worked there over 5.5 years. I worked at Raymond James Financial. And can you imagine someone telling you that? Like, it made me think that, like, a lot of us are not only trying to hide or minimize our visible identities, but totally ignoring our non-visible identities as well in the workplace. And because I noticed that early on, I make that conscious choice to allow my dimensions of diversity be present and positively impact my own career path. And with that, I've had the pleasure of networking and having really great conversations with people at all levels, including, you know, incredible mentors and sponsors that poured wisdom and gems into my life. And being able to utilize that over the last few years has been nothing short of a blessing. I mean, if you look at my humble beginnings, like Andreas mentioned, compared to where I am now, I felt like I beat every statistic that they've written in a book. You know, if I were to go down to the public library and be like, show me all the statistics about a Black woman coming from, you know, low income household in Clearwater, Florida, you would be surprised to see that my picture is there. No, but I'm very proud of where I am. You know, I'm 28 years old, and I do take that into perspective, and I bring that dimension to work as well, because, you know, I'm always trying to compare myself to my colleagues and the friends that I make at work. And I'm like, well, they're buying a house and they're starting families and things like that. But, you know, some people have an age difference on top of me, right? And so I have to take that pressure off myself and say, hey, I am where I'm supposed to be. And, you know, that falls into that imposter syndrome as well, of like, do I belong here? You know, and so, you know, that can impact your professional trajectory for sure, you know, in relation to your question. So definitely, you know, I try to lead with authenticity, but then also with my personality, of course. I had to do the hair flip, but
I love it. Well, and you actually kind of started to touch on this. I want to make sure that we have time for folks to ask questions, because we do have a couple questions in the chat. But my last kind of question that I want to ask before we get to the chat is, what advice do you have for aspiring leaders? You know, you all sort of talked about, you know, barriers that you've encountered, especially structural ones, right? Like, and obviously, you know, there are lots of opportunities for folks to, you know, meet a barrier, move on, and then hopefully move forward with their trajectory despite, you know, adversity. But sometimes, like, it can be really tough depending on the industry you're in, who populates that industry. So I would just love to hear just advice you would have for other folks who are wanting to, you know, take on more leadership roles, wanting to see their own career path advance. Who wants to go first?
I can go. Oh, we all unmuted at the same time.
I love it.
Go ahead, Whitney.
Go ahead, Whitney.
I would just, you know, piggyback off of what I just saying, you know, sometimes we give ourselves a bad score, you know, and sometimes we use that fear within ourselves to predict what others will think of us and use it to hold us back. So what I would give to an aspiring leader, I feel like I'm still aspiring, even though I have been in leadership positions where I led my previous National Multicultural Inclusion Network at my previous organization. We all have a full range of differences and similarities that are visible and non-visible. And we must unpack how our own personal filters can impact our engagement in the DEI world. But don't get stuck in that, and remember that it's not just a job. A lot of people get into that mentality. Okay, I just work here. If you know that joke, it's like, oh, I just work here. I don't have the answer. But, get to know the people around you, get to know your team across your organization, and make genuine and authentic relationships and get to know people in those non-visible identities.
Great. Andres?
Yeah, I'll just build on what Whitney just shared and provided. I think given my own lived experiences, my own career journey, and what I hear from our staff and the work that I get to lead, I would say a couple things. Number one is stay true to who you are. That's first and foremost. I mean, I think that it's really easy to lose your identity or identities based on who you work for. And I would caution everyone, especially a lot of our, new staff members, kind of those emerging leaders. I do a number of mentoring circles here at Freighter, and that's one of the pieces of advice that I provide to them. Stay true to who you are. Never compromise who you are ethically, morally, for the sake of wanting to fit in, right, or striving to succeed. Because if that's the case, that's a huge red flag. Number two, I would say grow in your role. One of the things that I have seen in many emerging leaders is they want to get to the next level, and taking shortcuts is not going to help you. And so I tell everyone, earn your stripes, right? Do the work, get to know the role well. So then you are, certainly have all the competencies and skill sets to grow into the next role. So that's another piece of advice. Number three, mentorship. If it was not for mentors in my life, quite frankly, I don't think I would be part of this discussion today, that I would have been able to excel in my career professionally and even personally, for that matter, if I did not have great mentors that actually spoke in my life along the way. And then the last two are kind of interconnected, is be open, continue to have a student or learner mentality, seek stretch assignments. I will say that that's probably the one piece of advice I was given earlier in my career by my mentor, and said, every time that there's an opportunity, raise your hand. Try to learn, try to actually stretch yourself, because that's going to give you the ability to grow in terms of your skill sets and competencies. So that's important. And for those of you who have ERGs, employee resource groups, or business resource groups in your organizations, get involved in those groups and in those efforts. I will say that, again, if those groups are aligned to strategy, as they should be, that is going to give you great opportunities for exposure, to have a greater platform, to showcase your talents and skill sets, and hopefully also get credit for those roles so you can be promoted over time. And that is something that I actually have used over the years as part of our, pathways here and formula to continue not only to strengthen that pipeline, but actually to leverage the pipeline and to continue to grow the talent within the organization.
I'll try to be quick, Lindsay, because I know we want to get to questions as well. I would say for anyone identifying with any of the identities that we've talked about here, or any of the identities we haven't talked about here, and you find it impacting your work positively or negatively, my first piece of advice is get a good shrink, get a good therapist, and really make sure you are looking internally first and foremost. My story should be a warning to everyone that sometimes it's our own assumptions, and let's just call it our own internalized homophobia, and our own internalized racism, and our own internalized feelings about what we represent and what the world thinks about us, that impacts how we interact with our world. And so that's my first gesture, is sometimes we are our own limitations by having those internal dialogues that we have. And then I would say once you process that and you realize you're not blocking yourself, then it is, if you are an outspoken person and brave enough to be the spokesperson, test the system, right? If people say that we're open to all qualities of life and all families and looks of life, and we're open to the LGBT community, then talk about your partner at a group meeting and see how the room reacts. So does the room get quiet? Or do they lean forward and ask more questions? And I will tell you, it's a mixed bag in my professional experience. I've had people who quietly are very, very supportive of me, but who don't really engage with me about my personal life within the workplace. And so I think that if you have that within you, do it. And if you don't, then maybe lean to your allies within the group to test the system. I think that it isn't always our job as, and I saw someone had a question about tokenism, right? I don't want to be a tokenism. I don't want to be the person who is always the voice of the LGBT person because I'm the only LGBT. I'm actually the only man on our team as well. I don't want to always be the spokesperson for those things, right? So let's also have others on the team openly talk in favor of the supports that we as an organization say we're about.
And to piggyback off that, this is like just so we wrap up, but somebody did ask about tokenism. Have any of you ever felt tokenism or received any feedback as being a token hire? If so, how did you handle it?
I'm going to answer that first because I was short for the last one is no. And that's because no one talks about the LGBT thing. It is still the hush hush. We're open, we're cool. And I saw someone say, how can you be too gay? Well, I talk with my hands and I'm very open about who I'm dating. I'm very open about looking for my husband. Anybody out there looking to get married, give me a call. And so it's that kind of crazy conversation and openness that I have that I wondered, I am a vice president, but will I ever be the CEO? Right? And so that's what I mean by being too gay, because maybe people at a Christian organization don't necessarily want a CEO who's talking about he's looking for his husband. And those are the kind of cultural things that, no, I have not been tokenized because I have been accepted, but I have not been held up, if that makes sense.
Definitely.
I don't think anyone have overtly mentioned that or have stated that to me, but it has been implied in conversations. I remember in one particular organization, once I came on board, someone kind of referenced that. And my sense was, I said, hey, I'm willing to put my CV next to yours and we can go at it. I mean, I can show you my education, how many systems I have worked for, the type of stretch assignments I have globally and domestically based on, how fortunate I have been. Being bilingual, bicultural, and I think it's sometimes also willing to have those crucial conversations with folks to let them know that you're not going to be certainly either shy about having the discussion or willing to engage in that type of discussion, because if they're willing to do it with you at the level that you're coming in, imagine how they actually treat others in the organization. And again, given my role and the work that I lead, I'm always careful about that. And it's like, well, I have to have a crucial conversation with this individual, given, some of those comments. So that's the way that I actually have approached that. And obviously people then start backpedaling and wanted to say, I never meant that, or that's not what I said. And then I will say, well, just in case that's what you meant, I just wanted to make sure that I clear the air with you. So we're clear on where we stand and, my accolades and certainly my degrees, to be able, right, that I have earned the right to be sitting around this table, not that it was actually given to me based on my ethnicity or anything else for that matter. But I think it continues to be a reality. And I think to Daniel's point, it is something that continues to be a reality for many of our organizations because it is part of the systemic racism that we all have built, in our organizations based on, traditions, policies, processes, approaches that have existed and where people, right, what has given people the ability to thrive, and others, that have not had those opportunities as well. So.
Anything else? I know we're trying to wrap up. Whitney, did you have any last anything to add?
Nothing to add, Everyone said something really great.
Okay, yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity to speak. I just want to thank all three of you for your vulnerability, your, speaking your truth, and for sharing that with us today. It's been extremely poignant, and I've just loved getting to know each of you. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you so much to Eric Smith. Thank you, Dr. Lindsay Grove. Thank you, Inclusivity LLC, Daniel Gibson, Andreas Gonzalez. Like, this has been an incredible experience. You guys are really great. And I will be connecting with you all on LinkedIn.
Thank you all so much for just the platform and the opportunity to share.
I echo both comments, all the sentiments. Thank you.
Thank you all, Whitney, Andres, Daniel, Dr. Grove. Love it. This has been amazing. A couple of points I want to make, and as we've had three powerful conversations. So I just want to mention a couple of things that kind of rose to the top for me, is that when I look at allyship, and some of my I see Andres' face. I'm really curious how he's going to take this. But when I look at DEI professionals, I hear the word ally. I engage with it. I think it makes sense. However, I think an ally still has the opportunity to choose. I can engage if I want to. I can disengage if I want to. If it gets too hot, I can walk away. As an accomplice, I'm in. So far, if you go down, I go down. Therefore, I think there is an additional layer. And some of my colleagues may be like, Eric, you're crazy, but that's fine. I've been called worse. Of being an accomplice. And that means I'm standing on the firing line with you. So if they're coming at you, they're coming at me. It's a different level. And one, as an ally, you have to be invited in. That level you do as well, but it's a different level of commitment and engagement. And so we saw allies in 2020. We also we see allies now. And that doesn't look the same as it did before. Accomplices never change. They're in it. So that was one piece I wanted to add. Another piece is I want to talk a little bit about how inclusivity defines equity. And many of you who heard from me know how I have heard this story, but equity requires more. And I mean that in the sense of equity requires two things to happen before you can get there. One, you have to acknowledge disparities exist. That's easy. Do it all the time. We have a wonderful amount of data that says that. It's easy to say the what. The next piece of this, which makes it extraordinarily difficult, is to acknowledge that the systems in place that govern us, whether that's within your organizations or within the country, were built by a group of people for the benefit of themselves at the risk or detriment of others. Let me say that again. Systems in place were built by a group of people for the benefit of themselves at the expense of others. Once you can acknowledge that, and that's the hardest part, then we can talk about equity, which requires a disproportionate investment in those that have been marginalized. So it's not equality. It's not fair. That's not the point. Equity requires more because they've been at a disadvantage for so long. To level the playing field, they're going to need the boosts that have been given to others since the dawn. So I just want to kind of level set some of that stuff just to make sure it's kind of clear how we look at these things. And the last piece is around tokenism. Tokenism is critical. Tokenism is not a bad word. The challenge is if tokenism never gets to critical mass. The path to critical mass involves tokenism. You have to be a first. When I say I went to Duke University, they say, so what sport did you play? And of course I say basketball. Anybody who's met me, I am 5'2" all day with boots on. And they say, well, what position? I say center. So of course I'm being silly about it. The point of it, why couldn't my parents have afforded it? Why couldn't I have been smart enough to go to the institution? So the idea of it is, can we start to look at things a little bit more critically and realize that there's bias that's flying around all over the place? But the idea of this, seriously, the idea of this is we're here to build bridges, not barriers. That's the idea of thriving in a house divided. So I just wanted to kind of put up a couple of things out there. This has been, going to ask my wife, oh, if you didn't know, Daquanda Turner-Smith, that's the boss, that's my wife. So I've been bouncing around, going back and forth between our two rooms. And because the conversations have been off the chain, curating this group of folks has been absolutely incredible. And we're only halfway through. So I hope you all are as excited as I am. We're going to, if we could pull the PowerPoint back up, I I want to highlight something real quick, and then we're going to have another kind of special piece for you to engage in. Debbie Fund. This is our kind of big announcement for this year, is that we've created, through the help of the Pinellas Community Foundation, a Debbie Fund, Diversity, Equity, Belonging, and Inclusion. It supports community work. It provides safe and responsible ways to engage. It strengthens our community, and we're looking for systems change and benefits what was talked about before, the Tampa Bay Equity Incubator, as well as this conference. We're asking for your help. So you can go to, as you see it up here, and it's been put in the chat, pinellascf.org/Debbie Fund. We really need your help to move this along. All of these conferences are free to the public. If you go through the Tampa Bay Equity Incubator, that's been funded through the Kellogg Foundation. Thank you very much for them, for that support. But all of this takes resources. And we're really, with everything that's going on, from inflation to the lack of support, frankly, that we've gotten from the corporate community, which I wish would change, we really need your help and support. Anything will help. This is the proverbial passing of the hat. Really need your support for these kinds of things. We've never gone this far to ask for support, but if we're going to be able to change the system, if we're going to be able to get to critical mass with moving some of these things along, we need your help. We need community support to get there. So please, a nickel, a dime, a dollar, please support us and tap into the Debbie Fund and put in your contribution. We truly appreciate it. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Jonathan and Collaborative Labs to kind of chat about what they see. Jonathan?
Okay. Let's see, I'm just going to share screen. Okay. So as Eric said, we're halfway through, and there's a lot of great information that we're kind of just going through and listening. I'm at the stage where I call it notes-taking mode, where we just listen, take notes, capture the highlights, visualize some things that stand out to the group, to myself, and at some point during the day, we will kind of switch gears and try and bring all this together in a more impactful visual, something that tells a deeper story and ties all these elements together. So that's what we have so far. Stay tuned.
Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. That is wonderful. And we definitely look forward to the reveal at the end. So you all have to stay around so you can see what Jonathan comes up with. We are so pleased and happy and hope you all are continuing to enjoy the conference this afternoon. So feel free to if you're just joining us, make sure you're putting in your information in the chat so you all know who's here. We're adding some links to the chat as well, including our self-care bios. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Collaborative Labs so they can explain what's going on next.
We're ready for our self-care lunch hour, and we have 3 sessions you can choose from. We have meditation, yoga, and Zumba. And once I open up these breakout rooms, this is how you will enter the rooms. There's a little icon at the bottom that will show up, it says breakout rooms. If you do not see that, you'll see a little 3 ellipses that says more, and the breakout room icon should be in that. And you can see the 3 different sessions you can choose from. So I'm going to go ahead and open those breakout rooms.
John,
enjoy your
I'm
lunch
sorry,
session.
PJ, before you do that, just to explain to everyone, the sessions will probably be ending in about an hour. Then we wanted to make sure, about 40 to 50 minutes, we wanted to make sure that you all have time to hydrate, get a lunch break in, make sure you eat before we come back to the afternoon session at 1 o'clock. So make sure that you are taking your break as well after your self-care session. Thank you all.
Absolutely.
And you'll be automatically brought back to the main room when it's time.
Yes, we will close the breakout rooms in 50 minutes. So yes, I will go ahead and open up the breakout rooms and enjoy your lunch, enjoy your sessions.